Okay, we're covering a series of topics. Pam covered identity, user accounts and provisioning. Gil's going to talk about authorization. I got authentication. When we put this together, we put a rather silly food theme on it. I think
it was not silly.
Okay.
It was inspired.
Okay, we put an inspired food theme on it. We may have gone a little bit too far on it in some ways. I think mine will be a little bit less, but I'll try to keep the theme up. You can help me by throwing tomatoes, I guess. All right, introduction to authentication. In the general scheme of things, Pam did provisioning, which has to do with getting the right ingredients, getting the menu together, getting the food together. I'm going to talk about authentication, and the rough analogy here is authentication is the main course because what we really want to do is get to dessert. So that's going to be and that's authorization. So we're going to talk about the difference between those three areas. To start with, we're going to start with some definitions and purpose. We're going to talk about authentication methods, how they work, how they don't work, some particular problems with passwords, and some potential improvements that are coming along. We're going to talk about federated authentication, which is really mostly what I want to get to. And then also some emerging trends and future directions on some things that I think are coming down the pike that will help even beyond federated authentication. So this presentation has been prepared for newbies. This was the intent when we put it together. From sitting through Pam's presentation, I think this group is quite a bit more advanced, I think, than we thought. So we can definitely up-level it. I would much prefer getting questions from the audience. There's a whole bunch of people I know here that are very capable, and the best I can do is moderate, because there will be somebody in the audience that can answer, I think, pretty much anything. So all heckling is encouraged. Advanced hecklers, please see number one. There was, I was surprised, Paul Madsen was here earlier, he left. He heckled me really well last year. He's definitely an advanced heckler. I was going to encourage him to heckle me this time as well, because even though he's an advanced heckler and we need to keep in mind this is a newbie presentation, the historical significance of having Paul give a positive, a constructive heckle would be worth dealing with, because he only does, we'll go on. All right, so this is a newbie presentation, but I'm definitely going to work on I don't know if it's up-level or down-level. We can go into a lot more detail as needed. Please feel free to let me know as we go. So we're going to start with some definitions. And yeah, this is a great slide. I am well known in my presentations for doing the wall of text technique. This is a wall of text. But this is an actual screenshot of the OpenID Connect specification. And one of the things I think is very useful about the OpenID Connect specification, oddly enough, is that it's got a section of terminology that I think is well written and makes sense. It's you can look through this list of things: authentication, authentication request, authentication context, authentication context class. It's a lot like distilled monoglycerides, monocalcium phosphate. The things over here. It's the ingredient list. But it's actually quite useful in an identity sense to get some rigorous definitions down for what we mean by some of these terms. So a few definitions to start. And these are actually taken from the OpenID Connect specification. Entity, a thing. How many programmers have had long discussions about object-oriented programming and what is an object? Entity is a thing that can be identified. An identity is a set of attributes related to an entity. An identifier is something that is part of the identity that identifies an entity. Authentication is the process to achieve sufficient confidence in the binding between the entity and the presented identity. Whew. You should have to try to read that from here. It's difficult. But the point is, an entity is something that can be identified. We use abstract terms about identity services, identity and access management as a group of processes and things. But for the purposes of the OpenID Connect spec and the purpose of this talk, An identity is essentially a user account. It's a set of attributes that identify a thing, in this case, a user. So that is what we mean by an identity. An identifier, Pam covered in a bit of detail about the different kinds of identifiers that are used in, for example, an Active Directory world. Authentication is the process of binding an identity to an entity for the process in the process of doing something, and that's the whole point of this presentation: is what does that mean, and why do we do it, and where is the industry going with this? So, when we were working on our presentation yesterday, Gil and Pam and I, and they were going over their slides, and I was going over my text outline because I didn't have any slides yet, and we were talking about the authentication event. Pam immediately said, well, the authentication event is a very important security context. It is like a candlelight dinner. It has ceremony. You sit down, it establishes the context. There is a sense of the security ceremony that you want users to be comfortable with the login screen, that there's nothing out of order, that this establishes the security context for a transaction. So Pam's idea was the dinner. My idea is authentication is an irritant, an irritating thing that we have to do to get on to the next thing. We're trying to do something. We're on our way to someplace else, and authentication is in the way. Let's get it out of the way so that we can get on to what we're trying to do. So there's definitely some difference of opinions. I think they're actually both valid, but it's different how you look at things.
You don't imply In-N-Out burgers.
No, In-N-Out Burger is not irritated. That's why I chose that slide. I stopped at In-N-Out Burger on the way here from the Bay Area. And yeah, it's great, but it's the delivery window. Anyway, why do we authenticate? Authentication is necessary for authorization. That's I'm going to keep bringing that in mind. That I've seen plenty of presentations and talks that. About the future of authentication, but I think it helps us a lot if we always keep it in mind that authentication, at least in my view, is an irritant to get to something else. We need to authenticate so that we can apply authorization. Authentication of a user is necessary to allow the user to do something, and that's another key point. What Pam discussed was user accounts, identities, which is identity information at rest. Authentication is the hook. It's the initial point that when a user is now in motion, the user is going to start doing something. And authentication is required to know who the user is, to know if they're authorized to do something. So authentication is the user in action. And then a great quote from Gil, from Pink Floyd via Gil: if you don't eat your meat, you can't have any pudding. How many know? How many people would have recognized that line right away? All right, yes. I think that's more than automated provisioning.
Absolutely.
Right there. Okay, so why do we authenticate? To get to authorization. The line was pudding, but my wife likes molten chocolate cake a lot better, so we're going to see a lot more pictures of molten chocolate cake than pudding. That's the point. We do this to get to authorization. So authentication methods, and did we set the timer so I can? Okay. Authentication methods and the problem with passwords. So, a quote from a long time ago that I had a link to this blog, and I haven't seen Jeff Boren for a long time. And I went to look at the blog, and it's no longer active, so I don't know what happened there. But I remember this from Jeff Boren years ago. Passwords are easy. Change is hard. And we've been working on getting rid of passwords for 20 years, 30 years, I don't know, at least since as long as we've been doing computers. And we still have passwords. They're still there. They're still a problem. They're still overused. Passwords are easy, and change is hard. And we, as an industry, we have to figure out how to do this. We have to get past passwords. So let's talk about some of the problems with passwords before we get into some potential solutions. Protecting password data is difficult, but it's necessary, because you have to be able to authenticate a user through a password mechanism. We'll get to some other mechanisms later in the talk. But for authenticating users with passwords, you've got to have something on the server side to do that validation. And that means that somebody's going to try to get that data. This picture was actually me sitting under that palapa with a with my lunch there, and this seagull was trying to get in to get my lunch. So that's the illustration here, is that people are always trying to get to the password file. I had to explain it. People are trying to get to the password file, and this is the problem. The first thing was, if you just save the password file in clear text, then anybody that hacks into the system can get all those passwords and use them. So you don't do that. You save password hashes in non-reversible fingerprint, and so you don't store raw passwords in the database file. However, there's techniques like lookup tables, dictionary tags, rainbow tables, that if you get a large database of passwords that have been stored as message digests, that you can very efficiently go through and crack all of those passwords. So that doesn't work. So the hackers got around that. So, however, now if you use salting techniques, so every time you store a hash password, you hash it with a different value, and even if that value is stored right next to the password hash or as part of the password hash, it means that you can't do a table lookup to break all of them once. You have to crack each one of them individually because it's salted with that particular hash. The hash is salted with a unique value. And that's about as close as I'm going to come to getting any food references into this slide, as hashes and salt. But even that, CPU and GPU capabilities, now the brute processing power has increased even faster than memory and disk prices have dropped. Right, so now with the graphic processing units, you can easily crack 8-character passwords. Used to take 195 years on the table on the right here. Now you can do it in 3.4 days. It's just dropping fast how easy it is to brute force crack passwords. So the point of this is it's an arms race. Every time we come up with a technology to make this easier, something happens to defeat it. So we need to make sure that we allow authentication to be replaceable to handle the evolution in these systems. So it's always one step ahead. So there's problems with storing passwords. There's problems with users on how they use passwords. So this article is from 2010, so it's from a while ago. But Gawker was a blogging site in New York. It was considered kind of low value. It was a gossip site. People would leave comments. They'd have to create an account before they could leave comments. But it was a kind of an ad hoc gossip site. It got hacked. It linked the password files. The next day, LinkedIn, Yahoo, I think there's World of Warcraft. There's a couple of others listed in the body of the article. All of these major sites had to issue warnings to their users to change their passwords because Gawker had really bad security and they stored their passwords in the clear. People got the password file, and users used the same passwords that they did for LinkedIn, that they did for Yahoo, everything else. So they, World of Warcraft, heaven forbid that they could get into my World of Warcraft account and be me. But users are tired of passwords, so they reuse passwords. This is a problem. We need to get out of the business of having so many passwords and inflicting password fatigue on our users. Okay. How many people know XKCD? Oh, okay, the audience is scoring low on that one. You guys more people need to know XKCD, because anything or anything covered in computer science is usually covered in XKCD at some point, or human interactions. What is it? A webcomic of romance, sarcasm, math, and language. It's awesome. So I highly recommend you look at XKCD wherever possible. A few years ago, the XKCD comic strip had this one panel. It's a single panel comic that describes that foreshort passwords are easy to remember and hard to crack, and he goes into the math as to why that is. That password policy really doesn't help. If you notice in the panel in the upper left, he uses a 0 instead of an O, a 4 instead of an A. It has an ampersand and a numeral in it. And he goes into why this doesn't really help that much to do this fancy substitution. It's pretty easy to crack those things as well. You always do a substitution that is easy for humans to remember. A 3 is like an E, a 4 is like an A. So it's not that hard for the crackers to add to their software to test for those capabilities. So it doesn't really help that much. What we need is longer passwords. If you do 4 short words, the actual difficulty in cracking is much, much harder, and it can be actually easier to remember. So the example he gave is correct horse battery staple. If you just had those words, correct horse battery staple, pretty easy to remember, and you type that in, that would be much, much harder to crack. Remember this previous slide where we talked about on a GPU, you can now crack a password in 3.4 days if it's 8 characters long? Well, correct horse battery staple is considerably longer than 8 characters, and that's much, much harder to crack. There's some good open source projects that are already implementing this technique. A project that I worked on, Cloud Foundry for VMware, at the time implemented one of these in their password policy. So we didn't have any funny characters. All it was when you created your password, we would give you a strength score. And the score had to be a certain amount. We had to have a special check for correct horse battery staple because people kept typing that in. But that was the point, is that you could have a dynamic back-end system that would check the password strength and allow you to set the password, and you could end up with a password that was much easier to remember and yet much harder to crack, as opposed to the XKCD's author's conclusion at the bottom of the comic where he says, through 20 years of effort, we've successfully trained everyone to use passwords that are hard for humans to remember but easy for computers to guess. And that's pretty much what we've accomplished in passwords so far, is making it harder for people. So when I worked on the Cloud Foundry system, we implemented this. I thought it was great. I started using long passwords everywhere, and then I started using my mobile phone. And oh man, it sucks for on the mobile phone to have a correct horse battery staple password. So I think there's more we have to go here, but no, Brandon, I want your question. There's further we need to go to make this usable. What was your question? Absolutely. There is at least 2 aspects of that we're going to cover. But are you aware of any, I don't know, say asymmetrical solutions that would help that in the future, so that people, you know, and when we get to that slide, you can put in a plug for that session. So there are some capabilities out there that that don't share secrets like that. So okay, so I think this was an advance to be able to do long passwords like this. So this is a good idea, but as was pointed out, it's got problems too. Another problem that, and we'll talk about that more in a minute as well, but another problem here is the password anti-pattern. So talk about a wall of text. I didn't want to take multiple slides for this. This is actually from my blog from a few years ago. So you can go find the actual text there. I don't expect anybody to be able to read it, but I didn't want to cover multiple slides. The left-hand side is actually a screenshot of a dialogue from E-Trade. And I just encountered this again the other day, so I believe this is still active. The original blog post I wrote was from a few years ago. But it wants to know if I want to link my E-Trade account to my bank account. And to do so, it asks for my username and password. And I thought, well, I'm already logged into E-Trade. Why do they want my username and password? It has a little thing on the bottom that says powered by Yodlee. Does anybody here work for Yodlee? Okay, good. Then I can give my full opinion. It's being recorded anyway. But it asked for a username and password. I thought, well, I'm already logged in. Why are they asking for my username and password? There's a little help button there. So I click on that. What does that really mean? And it says, please enter the login information for the bank your external account is on. So I'm logged into E-Trade. They have a deal with Yodlee, and they're asking for my username and password for my bank account. They can be me at the bank account. Exactly what Brendan just was describing. You can't delegate access on a password. That means I'm giving them my password, and they can be me. And wow, that's how passwords work. So, but that's kind of harsh. I want to click to see what the terms and conditions are. So that's what this wall of text on this side is. And I want to read part of it to you. It says, you hereby grant E-Trade Securities and Yodlee a limited power of attorney. You appoint E-Trade Bank and or E-Trade Securities and Yodlee as your true and lawful attorney in fact and agent with full power of substitution and resubstitution for you in your name, place, and stead in any and all capacities to access third-party internet sites, servers, or documents, retrieve information, and use your information as described above with full power and authority to do and perform each and every act and thing requisite and necessary to be done in connection with such activities as fully to all extents and purposes as you might or could do in person. Wow. It's like, okay, so I want a little convenience here. I want to link my bank account to my E-Trade account. All I have to do is sign over complete power of attorney to Yodlee.
So just to be clear, the purpose of this isn't strictly to link your accounts, to prove you have the bank account.
Right, yeah.
So they're using that as a proof of identity.
Right.
And this is one of the solutions. The other solution is the deposit money and then
Which is the one I always do, is the little deposit thing where you get to,
you get free money.
you know, well, they take it back.
Well, they did.
They did for me. That's how I like that account. Wow, I'm going to complain. So anyway, what I really like about this is at least this is being clear about what the password anti-pattern really means. If you are going to go to a site and that site says, let me get your password for some other site, then you are turning over full power of yourself, full authority for yourself with your password to that site. And this is still going on. You know, we need to fix this. Okay, so password problems are even misunderstood. I just find this one mostly humorous. But this also gets back to the issue of one of the problems with the correct horse battery staple solution. You know, really long passwords still don't solve a whole class of problems. They help to prevent hacking on the server side, but this article is about a botnet that installed a virus on a whole bunch of machines and essentially had a keyboard logger on large numbers of users' machines. The article is funny because it says 2 million passwords stolen from Facebook, Yahoo. You know, when I first read that headline, I think, wow, somebody was pretty good if they hacked into those sites because those guys are good at protecting their security. Yeah, no data was lost from Google, Twitter, or Facebook or any of those places. This was client side. This was a keylogger running on users' machines. So the article is written to tell you how to protect yourself. It says what to do because this data was stolen from Facebook. Well, it wasn't stolen from Facebook. It was stolen from users' machines. But it says what to do. You should set passwords to be more than 8 characters and or more than 4 character types. That wouldn't help at all for a keylogger. It's completely irrelevant. The character type, and they also said make sure you change your password to be something unique, so it's not what's going to be shared with other people. It's totally irrelevant. You've got a keyboard logger that is recording all your passwords to every site that you use them. So even if you had a long password, even if you had a unique password, even if it had a digit and a punctuation, it doesn't help. So even what's written in the press can get a little confused about passwords. Okay, good. All right, so beyond passwords, password managers, smart cards. There's a lot of stuff that's been around for a long time. That some have strengths, some have weaknesses. There is various multi-factor authentication systems, SMS message and other callbacks. There's this little thing that is a lot of tracks here at CIS called FIDO, which has to do with a multi-factor authentication that is, from everything I've seen, it looks really good. It's finally more convenient. As a VMware employee user, I use Secure ID all the time, and I think it's a really good example of why people don't like multi-factor authentication and VPNs and things like that. But I'm really hopeful that FIDO will help to alleviate that, and we'll finally get to better authentication. But I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that here because there's plenty of tracks about that at CIS. But what I want to get to is to use the password stories as an example of why we need to we need to go onto a different kind of system that that allows us to replace authentication, so that it's not entirely dependent on a single authentication system, but allows us to evolve, change, and even have multiple authentication systems. So we need a way to manage that transition. So let's talk about federated authentication. This is a page from Wikipedia called Indirection, and the line in the middle that you probably can't read from the back says, a famous aphorism of David Wheeler goes, all problems in computer science can be solved by another level of indirection. So we have a problem with authentication. We should be able to solve it by adding another level of indirection. There is something in the gray area there that says, there's a corollary to this that says, except that any problem can be solved by a level of indirection except for the problem of too many layers of indirection. Yeah, that could be a problem. There is some further parts of it that says it's easier to move a problem around, for example, by moving the problem to a different part of the overall network architecture than it is to solve it. So it's easier to move a problem than it is to solve it. Therefore, it's always possible to add another level of indirection. So that's what we're going to do to try to solve this authentication issue. But while we're on funny computer science jokes, I have to add my favorite one. There are two hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors. I love that because it's just so true in my experience in so many ways. Okay. All right. Old school federated authentication with this ancient protocol called SAML that is reputed to be dead, is the walking dead. It's not dead, and I'm joking about the old school reference, but we'll see why in a minute. But let's talk about what actually happens. And I want to be clear here. So we talked about that this was kind of a newbie presentation. I want to be more in-depth. It seems like this group is much more technically knowledgeable, and I want to be able to handle that. So feel free to redirect me, so to speak, and take me in a different direction on this discussion. But I want to also, though, not assume that people know where the redirects are happening, what an HTTP 302 is, what the back channel means. So I'm going to go to that level, but feel free to push me to go faster if you'd prefer. Let's go through this flow one at a time and talk about what actually happens at each step. I point a browser to web app A. I'm Joe. Joe starts at web app A, and he's not logged in. Web app A has no idea who Joe is. So he's going to redirect to a SAML identity provider because web app A does not have user accounts, does not have any password, does not know what authentication means, what authentication method to use. So it just redirects to the SAML IDP. Joe can log in to the SAML IDP in any way that SAML IDP chooses. It can be pick on a color wheel. It can be smart card. It can be username and password, anything. There's absolutely no limitation on what the authentication method can be to that SAML IDP. After the user logs in, that IDP is likely going to maintain a session with that user, probably by storing a cookie. And the only reason I say that is because Pam asked me to, and I only do whatever Pam tells me to in this presentation. And we had a reference in the abstract about hash and cookies. So it's the cooking reference. I have to make a cooking reference so I can say cookie there. So, but that actually is true. That's how the session would be saved. So it authenticates and then redirects back to the web app. Okay, so these are HTTP 302 redirects back to the web app with an artifact. So when it redirects back, I always think of HTTP redirects as I always imagine Obi-Wan going, the droids that you're looking for are not here. You know, so that it just all the redirect means is you go to a site and the site replies with an actual error code that says, I'm sorry, what you're looking for is not here, it's over there. So in this case, you go to, Joe goes to web app A, says what you're looking for is not here, it redirects the browser over to the IDP authenticates, redirects the browser back, but when it redirects back, there's a little decoration that it sends back with it. It's called an artifact. And the artifact is, the web app gets the artifact, and now it has a direct API call. This is the back channel. It takes a direct API call and calls the SAML identity provider and says, I got this little artifact, this little token, this little big number. Tell me who this user actually was. Now, it replies with a SAML assertion that says, okay, here's the user, here's how you validate it, here's some attributes about the user, groups that the user's in. And then the web app A can know who the user is, know some authorization information, and sets up its own session with the user. Now when the user goes to web app B or web app C, it points the browser there, the browser redirects over to the SAML identity provider, it sees that they already have a session via the cookie, they don't need to authenticate again, they just redirect back, you get single sign-on. So that is the basic SAML flow. That's the old school way. Now that was done, what, over 10 years ago? Well, in process, what, 2003, Connor?
Yes, specifically that's the attribute profile of
Yeah,
SAML. So there are a few other flows.
That's the artifact.
That's
Artifact profile.
Artifact binding, but there's a reason I chose that binding that we'll see. But this is one of the possible SAML flows. Okay, so but like I said, old school, that's been around over 10 years. The technology has improved dramatically. We have a whole new standard called OpenID Connect that does things very, very differently, as you'll see in this next slide. So this is SAML. This is OpenID Connect. Okay, so you can see how much progress we've made in the last 11 years. So.
I bet you don't have XML DSIG.
Yeah, that's true. There's no XML DSIG. And you got to understand that the terms have changed. I mean, just look at how different this is. Joe starts at web app A, but is not logged in, so he gets redirected to the OpenID Connect authorization server. Not an IDP. That's the SAML term. So he logs in with the method known only to the authorization server, which saves the session with Joe, probably in a cookie, and redirects to web app A with an OAuth2 ODC authorization code. It's not an artifact. It's an authorization code. Okay, so then web app A gets the OAuth2 authorization code and then makes a call, an API call. I don't hear the back channel term used as much for OAuth and OpenID Connect as I do for SAML. But nevertheless, the same thing. It makes an API call to exchange the authorization code for an access token. You know, not an assertion, an access token, and an ID token, more significantly. So, which sets up the session with Joe. The rest of it works the same. So in other words, this is exactly the same. It just works over SSL. It requires SSL as opposed to doing signatures. It doesn't use XML. It uses JSON in the ID tokens. It has some different characteristics, but the overall flows are exactly the same.
Yeah, but you're also showing a very old way of doing SAML though too. But the post is the more recent way of how most people do the SAML before the post.
That's not correct. So post was there and the artifact model were both there from the beginning at the same time. The artifact model is used in a lot of cases because it doesn't require
I chose this one for the humor value, so. That's- but, okay, but actually, when I put together this slide, there is one aspect of this slide that I do think is very significant between these two systems. And that's, I put in the blue font, which you probably can't read, but right in step number 4, it says the web app exchanges the authorization code for an ID token, which corresponds to what I've normally seen SAML assertions used for, via the back channel. But it also gets an access token, which is an OAuth 2 construct that Gil will go into in more detail. And that is one area that I see as being significantly different between the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect approach versus SAML in practice. And that is that it's a 4-party system. You get an access token that this application can then use to gain access to resources via APIs at a resource server. So there is one step of delegated authorization that I think has been added, or at least emphasized more, in OAuth 2 that I think is an improvement over the previous flow. Okay.
Do you see Federation packages, industry standard packages going away from SAML and using the OAuth and then OpenID?
So that's a really good question. Do I see things going away from SAML to OpenID or OAuth 2, or the combination of the two? As was famous at this conference a few years ago, they said SAML is dead. No, I actually don't think so. I think SAML is going to be around for a long, long time. Every system, the last 2 systems I've worked on implemented both SAML and OAuth 2. I don't see either of them going away. There is a situation of that enterprise use cases tend to use SAML, and it's not always this way, but tend to use SAML more, whereas cloud providers seem to be using more OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. When you start chaining these things together, a system that I've worked on had SAML coming from the enterprise to a common identity broker that then produced SAML going out, an outgoing SAML that then produced an OAuth 2 token that went to an actual resource server. Remember the quote earlier about too many levels of indirection? Once you get that many things chained together, the performance gets pretty bad. But they do work. So I don't see either of them going away for the foreseeable future.
I'm probably asking the wrong person this question, but I probably should raise it to Gil, but I'm sure I probably know Gil will talk about it. I'd like to ask to get your viewpoint. Obviously, we've got SAML and for Federation Authentication, we've got example for the authorization components, and yet we've also now got OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. Aren't we effectively duplicating really, 2 different ways of doing the same thing, trying to achieve the same thing?
I think that's a real difficult question, so you should ask Gil. No, we actually talked about that quite a bit yesterday in preparation, and Gil will have some really good material on that. But at least as I see it, I think these things are doing a really good job of staying out of each other's way. You can use SAML or OpenID Connect for federated authentication. You can use OAuth 2 for delegation of a certain amount of authorization information, but then you need XACML to take that information and make policy decisions. So I actually don't see a lot of conflict between those on that chain. There was a question from over here.
Any of these standards provide a standard way for passing along the level of authentication within the user login to the power field, or back it off?
Yeah, so the question is do they have a way of passing along the authentication that was required? And we're actually going to talk about access policy and step up auth here in a minute. But I think each, trying to remember, the ID token, OpenID Connect, has a field in it for passing the authentication context.
Yes, ACR is the field in OpenID Connect.
And SAML does as well. So yeah, there is in both standards the ability to pass along what authentication or sets of authentication methods were used for a particular assertion.
I think in the ID token, there's the authentication context, and I believe there's another attribute that starts with A that actually talks about the method by which the authentication method. So you can actually say the assurance is level 3, and the method was, oh, Roland knows.
Yeah.
Authentication method.
There you
Okay.
go. ACM, is that right?
ACML.
ACML, okay.
All right. I think there's both level and specific methods. We're actually going to talk about this in just a minute in a little bit more detail. And if we need help in it, we're going to ask Shraddha, who's sitting right next to Roland, because she's implemented this. Janelle.
Anyway, it seems like we're just trying to solve a problem that the underlying protocol just doesn't talk about. The HTTP protocol doesn't state this, right? So is there any thoughts or movement within the HTTP protocol, like the next version, that might add state components so that a user can authenticate and that the session's managed and maybe we're not passing around?
So the question is, it seems like we're putting this on a higher layer when it should just be built into HTTP. Well, as long as I've been working in this area, there's the notion of that there's a missing layer of the internet, and I think that's kind of a reference to that.
Isn't that WS security?
Yeah. It still ships in Xbox, doesn't it? So I don't have an answer for that. I don't know what's going on in the actual HTTP area for this. I think the actual notion of cookies, though, and how you manage sessions, there's a lot of work in the OpenID Connect working groups on session management. I also think the problem is changing just because of the nature of how applications are evolving, that as we get to API-driven, I see a lot less emphasis on cookies and sessions and more on things like refresh tokens, access token lifetimes, how those things are refreshed, and what we're going to see here in a few minutes, continuous authentication, so that the existing notion of a session kind of dissolves and becomes tokens. So I don't have a good answer for that one. Okay, progress in identity evolution. We've already talked a little bit about XACML and externalized authorization. So I just thought this was an interesting graphic. I know Gil is going to cover it somewhat as well. We started out with one identity or user account per application. Then we externalized identities via LDAP. That's what Pam talked about, that you could have multiple applications that use the same directory service, so therefore they have the same user information, the same password, but each application still has to handle that password. So now we have external authentication via SAML. I think there has been a little bit of an improvement for OpenID Connect and OAuth 2, that now we have external authentication and roles that come in the access token. And the next step would be to get to actual external authorization, and that's what Gil's going to be talking about. But I think we're just starting adoption of OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. So this is where we are on the timeline.
Isn't OAuth 2 still having some issues doing that?
So the question is, does OAuth 2 have some security problems? There was an article in the press recently called Covert Redirect that I thought was overly hyped. It was not a problem with the protocol. There were some implementations that did not follow the security recommendations of the protocol, so they were susceptible. But it was published as a flaw in the protocol, and I don't think it was. As we saw in some of the password articles, the press doesn't always get these things right. Okay, does federated authentication need to be so complex? Let me check the time. This is kind of a whiny slide, just for me, because I do this for a living, and I sit in meetings a lot of times, even with technologists, and they say, God, why is this federated authentication so hard? So I thought about it. I wrote this down. I'm just going to read it in case people can't see it. I went to Starbucks and ordered a venti coffee with cream with my Visa debit card. The Visa network contacted my bank, which transmitted an authorization code to Starbucks. The authorization code was used to transfer funds to Starbucks from my account. I enjoyed the latte. Now, teenagers, most adults, supposedly tech-averse grandmothers have no problem understanding this. This is easy, right? It's a debit card. I'm getting a latte. My mother does this just fine. Now, same story. I pointed a browser at my employee benefit site and selected our payroll provider, ADP. The benefit site presented a SAML artifact to ADP. The artifact was used to retrieve an assertion which authorized access to my payroll information, which I could see, and I wish I made more money. That's exactly the same flow, pretty much. Programmers, technologists, and tech executives claim that this is too difficult, right? The one on the right is too difficult. The one on the left is easy. I don't understand that. So maybe we need some better marketing, but I think we need federated authentication, and we need to make it simple and easy to understand, as Visa has done with debit cards. So to get to the actual meat here, the advantages of federated authentication. Fewer numbers of identity and authentication sources means less exposure. So if I have less accounts, as that federated authentication slide showed, I used 3 applications that used 1 IDP. If I have fewer user accounts, then I have less places where my password is stored. So that's overall a benefit. There is a problem that means that if I have a fewer number of larger identity providers, those are more attractive targets. But I think that is more than countered by the fact that it also allows them to be the professionals that manage security properly. As we saw in some of the earlier articles, places like Gawker that do not specialize in security end up having security holes. We don't see the same security holes with Google or Yahoo or Facebook. Facebook has other issues, but I heard some snickers behind me. So, but I think the model is good to have fewer. And I don't want just one. There's a lot of times I hear people say, "Couldn't I just have one?" I don't want just one. I want multiples, but I want a few multiples, not 200 like I would have if I had an account at every application. Okay, so identity and authentication sources can specialize in security. We covered that. Another important aspect is that means the IDP can change the authentication method as things change, right? So passwords can be cracked easier. Something comes up, I get a keyboard logger. I can move to a FIDO system. I can change all of that at the IDP without changing every application. So that's another big advantage for federated authentication. Varying methods can be used based on identity provider policy. So it's another important aspect that my team, I mentioned Shraddha, who works with me at VMware, has implemented in the last year on a product that we work on, that step-up authentication, that you can have different access policy for different applications. And when a user goes to access that application, they may be asked for increased credentials. This is in our own IT department. This is used for Workday and payroll information. There's a few applications that you have to use two-factor authentication to access, whereas others you don't. So what I've learned in the last year is people have been talking about these kinds of authentication policies. This came up in the question from over here for years, for decades. But when we actually implemented, we came up with a bunch of issues that we had not read about anywhere else. Things like if I have 5 authentication methods and 2 of them will work, and one of them fails, I try the first one, and one of them fails, what's the correct behavior at that point? Do I automatically prompt the user for the second one, or do I just say, no, stop, your access denied? These are issues that will come up. But federated authentication gives us the ability to do that, whereas we didn't even have that ability before. We get better user experience, longer-lived single sign-on with more control over revocation. Especially in the OAuth 2 OpenID Connect case, you can have long-lived refresh tokens. We did this in the Cloud Foundry system that I worked on, where you could be logged in for a week and have a long-lived refresh token, but the access tokens were never longer than 5 minutes. So that means you get the user experience is I can log in once per week, but the administration experience is my access can be revoked within 5 minutes at any particular time. And that's because the refresh token always goes back to the authorization server to get another access token as needed without interrupting the user.
Hey,
So
Dale, going back to your previous comment about the step-up authentication, is that essentially letting your authorization policies drive authentication?
I could see that. The question, that probably, I don't need to repeat that one, right? Because it was already, okay. I think is a way to get there. I mean, what we've implemented so far is no. It's the only, authentication is only to access the application in the first place.
Okay.
So it's usually driven by contractual agreements of what kind of authentication was required and how long it can last to get into the application, but then the application policy is outside of scope of that. But I think that's where we're going, is for those two to be intermingled. Right? So if I can repeat the question, it was, isn't this getting us away from the ability to say, session timeout, that there's some presence indicator? And I think, no. In fact, we're getting to the point where we need continuous authentication. And even the access policies that I just described, part of the policy was to access this application, you had to have used multi-factor authentication within this time period. We have time built into it. So I think that will continue to be part of the policy, but the presence indicator will be different than currently sessions and cookies. So I think we can talk about that more later, but okay. Another, just the last point here, and I'm running out of time. Partition security space. This is another very important part. I think Brendan made this point earlier about a password can be me anywhere, even if it's long. By using the technologies like OAuth2 and SAML, we can partition the security space. So I can say, this assertion that I am who I say I am with this strength of authentication is only valid at that application for this period of time. Unlike a password, which is valid until I reset it. Okay, so a lot of advantages to federated authentication. Future directions. We've already talked a little bit about authentication policy, including step-up auth and re-authentication intervals. I think that's come up in the discussion. I think we're going to get to continuous authentication and risk analysis. And then the last point I want to make in just a few minutes is there's also another initiative coming along called shared signals. But before, I'm going to spend a few slides on that, but then before we get there, remember why we authenticate. We're talking about all this authentication process, policy. This is all to get to authorization. It's all to get to GIL. Okay, so one last thought. Shared signals, I think, is a really interesting concept that, this is a great picture from the beach in Cabo. Shared signals, that makes sense. It's a concept that's come along. There's a white paper as part of the Open Identity Exchange, the shared signals model. It is the distribution of significant account events for improving integrity and decreasing fraud in online transactions. So what does that mean? It means that we often link accounts across providers. So I know I have a Yahoo account that has a Google account as its password reset mechanism. In these overall systems, rather than dealing with just passwords and authentication types, there's also a huge value in that all of these accounts tend to become interlinked. if we could come up with a system similar to law enforcement, where different law enforcement agencies share information with each other, and that helps in the detection of crime and fraud, if we had a portion of the identity system that shared signals. So, for example, if my Yahoo account got a signal from Google that said, you know, we know this account has just been taken over. You may not want to allow a password reset on this right now. Now, it has to be very carefully constructed for no exchange of identity information that was not known to an identity provider in the first place, only a signal that they can decide what the risk factors mean associated with that signal. But I think this is a step, this is a real effort going on right now, and is a step towards more of an environmental approach to identity that involves continuous authentication, continuous risk analysis, presence of the user, and gets us out of the mode of I logged in and I have access to that application. It needs to be a constant interchange of information in the environment.
Is this based on the global justice data exchange model? Is that what you're...
I'm not familiar with that, so I don't know.
That's the model that all law enforcement and in fact national governments use for exchanging terrorist watch data.
Yeah. Well, that'd be interesting, but I don't know that. So.
The NSA just do that for you?
Right. I won't repeat the question since it was an answer. All right.
One other question.
Okay.
You mentioned a little bit earlier on about you think there should only be, let's say, a few hundred IDPs. How do you then take that view when the reality like in Europe right now, there's early days admittedly, but there's quite a big growth in the personal identity.
Right. So maybe the question is would there only be a few hundred IDPs? And that was not my intent of what I said before. My intent was to say, as a user, I would expect to have accounts at 5 to 10 IDPs. I don't want to limit the number of IDPs in existence.
Or maybe you only have one account with your own personal identity vault.
Could be. Personally, I would still want a fault tolerance to have more than one somewhere, even if it was a personal one. But yeah, I would expect that I would only have a few accounts. I don't agree with the thought that there will be a consolidation of identity providers to the point where there's only a handful. Okay, so conclusions. I think we can read this here. That was a great fish taco. I think we're out of time. I've got 35 seconds. Questions?
So one observation, your comment about Visa versus Federation. One of the reasons why Visa's network is so simple is it's a closed network with very strong restrictions on everybody who joins the network, including the devices from one end to the other. And that makes it a lot easier to have something that's homogeneous and just works on the box. We don't have that in Federation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of issues. You know, I don't have to present my debit card and then somehow select what my bank is. Yeah, so the point of that flow was access codes and like a lot of things in this presentation, it was about humor, not about
Just take Federation. If we all had just adopted Passport, Federation would be a lot simpler today.
Well, I thought we did. I thought we just called it Facebook.
All right, on that note.
Okay, yeah, I think.
All right, thanks, everybody.